I used to work in a job that was really, it was, viewed as very successful from every lens you looked at it, except if you looked at what was happening inside of me, it was not successful. I was, over the last couple of years that I was there in that role, I had chest pains every day. I actually had been to the hospital 3 times in the last year I was there because I was sure I was having a heart attack. They said, no, it's just stress. I had dizzy spells that were so bad, there were times I couldn't even move, couldn't stand up because the room was spinning so hard. There were times that I had fatigue that was so overwhelming that I can remember vividly laying on the couch, wanting to get up and go eat because I was hungry and could not make my body move. And it was a little bit scary to have that level of fatigue. I had ringing in my ears all the time. I had nightmares that would wake me up almost every night of the week in the middle of the night, and I would be awake for an hour. Every time, because my adrenaline would be running so hard. And the only way I could function in that environment was this. I would buy 2 24-packs of this every single weekend, and I would drink almost all 48 cans all week long. When I was real young, it was 2 liters a day. And then at night, the only way I could sleep was NyQuil. So this was my life for years and years and years. And I remember it was about 7 or 8 years ago, I was just started here, and I was telling a friend of mine in the church this, and she looked at me and said, wow, you were so full of anxiety. And I have no idea what was on my face, but I know what was inside. I was mad. I'm like, in my head, I'm like, don't call that anxiety. How dare you call that anxiety? That wasn't anxiety. And then I started thinking about it, and it's like, oh, that was anxiety. I'd never named it. But I started thinking about all the things that I felt so anxious about. I felt anxious about the organization as it grew and grew and grew and the success. I was so worried that the day would come when they all said, all right, well, Brian's done as good as he can do. It's time to replace him and get a better leader in. That was always in my mind. I had what some people know as the imposter syndrome. That's like, oh, people are going to find out I'm just not as good as they think I am. And then they're going to want to be gone. They're going to want me gone. I had so much fear about what would happen if something ever happened to me because we had 14 staff members and we had this huge budget and it was all dependent, it felt like, on me, and I never called it anxiety. And you know why? And it took me a long time to realize this. I never called it anxiety because I'm a Christian and Christians can't feel anxious. So I was dealing with all the symptoms of it, but ignoring the actual underlying cause. And it was really, really, really hard for me. I'm being honest with you. It was super hard for me to get to the point where I could say it was anxiety. The reality about anxiety in our world is not pleasant. Look at this. In 2024, 43% of all adults in America said they feel more anxious this year than they did the previous year. I want you to think about that. Do you feel more anxious this year than you did last year? Are you part of that 43%? Over 40 million Americans have an anxiety disorder. So this isn't just anxiety, this is now affecting their lives. So it's now something they can't function in a normal, healthy way because of the anxiety. By the way, only just over 1/3 of those are actually getting any kind of help. So this is controlling and rerouting their life, and only 1/3 of them approximately are doing anything to try and get that anxiety to a point where they can function in a normal and healthy way. This stat has just killed me. For years I've known this one. 44% of millennials and 48% of Gen Z feel anxious or stressed all or most of the time. That word all, the moment I read it years ago, it was about 4 years ago I read that, I'm like, oh my goodness. All the time feeling anxious. When I feel anxious, I hate how I feel. It is an awful feeling inside my body. And here is the youngest generation saying that many of them feel anxious all the time. It never lets up. It never lets up. So what is anxiety? Well, anxiety is our body's natural response to perceived danger or real danger. So, just danger. So for instance, if you're on a ship in the middle of the ocean and all of a sudden the ship starts sinking fast and you're going down, and while you're going down, you see a great white shark just circling, right? You're going to feel anxious, right? It's your body's natural reaction to danger. It's like you are in danger in that moment, right? You are in danger. Some of you just even the idea of a shark, because you grew up like me, you watched Jaws, and it screwed you up forever. It's like, right? It's like even that, just thinking about it would make you feel anxious. It's like, so it has two impacts on us when we feel anxious. So there's an impact in our mind, which we'll talk about in this series, but there's also an impact in our body, a significant impact in our body. If you pay attention to your body, you can really feel it impacting you in some significant ways. And here's the thing we tend to think of anxiety as only a bad thing, but the reality is it can really drive you in some positive ways. It's just your body's natural reaction. For instance, some of you at points in your life felt anxious about a big test, and what did you do? You studied harder. Some of you. Right? Some of you felt anxious before the big game, and what did you do? You practiced more. It can actually drive positive behavior. Some of you felt anxious before having a really, really tough conversation with someone you love, and so you prepared for it. So we tend to think of it as only a negative thing, but the reality is it can have a lot of positive impacts in our lives. The way I want you to think about it, and the way we're going to talk about it in this series, is I want you to think of it like an alarm on your car. Now, I don't know how many of you have car alarms, but they can be really, really valuable. So my daughter, Natalia, lives up in the Twin Cities, and she drives an older Toyota Prius, doesn't have an alarm on it. So one morning she came out to get in the car to drive to work, no garage, so we parked on the street. She gets in, turns it over, and it sounds like a jet engine. She gets out, she's like, what's wrong? She looks under her car, thieves in the middle of the night, pulled up beside her car, got under it, cut the catalytic converter out. It's a big problem in big cities. Because there's a lot of valuable stuff in that, so they can sell it for some money, so she had to pay $700 to replace the catalytic converter. But she didn't have a car alarm. Would have been helpful, right? To have an alarm saying, hey, someone's trying to steal you, steal something, get out here, right? So that's what I want you to think of anxiety. It's like an alarm. Hey, there's danger here. The problem is, how valuable is a car alarm if all of a sudden a leaf falls on the car and it goes, danger, danger, you're in danger, right? Now all of a sudden it's not very helpful. And the problem is that depending on the experiences you've had in your lives, your anxiety response can get spun up so it's like a dial. And depending on the experiences you've had in your life and how you've processed or not processed those, you can have the dial really spun up high so that your body is telling you, your mind is telling you you're in danger when you're not even in danger. A leaf falling on your car is not dangerous. But all of a sudden the alarm's going off. So this is anxiety. It is a tricky thing. It is a huge thing. And what I want you to know is that if you don't understand the causes and what's going on inside, that here's what anxiety will do to your life. It will shrink your life. Anxiety will shrink your life. I read, prepping this message about a man who was studying to be a doctor. He was at the head of his class. But every year as he got closer and closer to graduating, the anxiety got worse and worse. And he rented a small place off of campus, and there was this big bridge he had to go over right before he got to campus every day. And his anxiety grew until one day he got to the edge of that bridge, he had to pull over, he couldn't even go over the bridge. The problem wasn't the bridge. The problem was the anxiety that he was feeling about the pressure of the school, but he couldn't go over the bridge. Anxiety makes your world smaller. It takes away the joy that God wants you to live with each and every day. It takes away your peace of mind. It adds stress to your life. The good news, and this is really, really good news, anxiety is one of the most treatable mental illnesses that there is. There is real hope for people who are struggling with anxiety. Real hope. And the Bible's full of practical advice. So we're starting a brand new series today called Anxious for Nothing. And this is what we want to get to. It's a play on words based on something Jesus said. And we're going to start today by talking about, I'm going to do something a little different. Typically, my messages are really, really focused on application. Today, I really want to do more diagnosis. I want to help you understand what's causing anxiety either in you or the people around you. Because if you're sitting here going, man, I don't have any anxiety, I don't understand why we're even talking about this, that's great. But I promise you, you are interacting regularly with someone who is. Because this is a huge issue in America. So take good notes for them. I want to ask you to open your program, take out the notes you'll find inside. Welcome to those who are watching online. Glad you're watching. If you want to go to our website at Penn Hill Church Life, you can get these notes as well. If you hear, by the way, I'm not a counselor. I'm not a psychologist. Didn't go to school for that. So what I did is I read them. And my favorite is a Christian psychologist named Dr. Henry Cloud. If you hear anything really good today, assume that it came from him. Anything bad, assume it came from me. So that's how I want you to think about this. So let's talk about the three major causes of anxiety. The first is the threat of isolation. This is the number one need that we have as human beings. And so therefore, it is the number one trigger of anxiety. The threat of isolation. Prepping this, I remember reading about a young woman. I read about a young woman who was talking about what it was like. She said this. She said, I remember waking up in the middle of the night as early as 4 or 5, feeling terrified and not knowing why. At the age of 4 or 5. She said, the first day of school was always really hard every year for me. She said, I have this moment frozen in my mind, standing in my locker next to my best friend, when I just knew in that instant the rest of the year would be horrible and that every day would be full of isolation, anxiety, and being alone. That was the first day of school for her every year. Isolation, anxiety of being alone. Now, it wasn't, she said, and then she said something I thought was so profound, and I want you to look at these words. She said, it was actually a good year, but look at this. Anxiety doesn't track very closely with reality. It is a critical theme that we're going to come back to in this series. Anxiety doesn't track very closely with reality. She had this anticipation that she was going to be alone and scared and isolated, and she wasn't. That wasn't what in reality happened, but it was what she was anticipating happening. And anxiety doesn't track very closely with reality. But it was a huge fear in her life. And the reason it was such a big fear is because it is our number one need as human beings. Whether you acknowledge this or not, when you look at the pages of the Bible, you see this played out for us. In the very first book of the Bible, called the book of Genesis, it tells the story of God's creation drama. How it unfolded. And God is going along, he's making things. And he's commenting on them. Makes it, goes, ooh, that's good. He makes them out, that's good. Makes them out, that's good. And then he makes man. And he goes, that's not good. But not because he made the man, but because the Lord God said it's not good for the man to be alone. The only time in the whole creation drama where he says something wasn't good. It's not good to be alone. So he made a companion. And in this story that we read in the book of Genesis, we have the basis for this huge trigger for anxiety. We were created to be in relationship, like God himself, who made us in his image, lives in creation, therefore becomes our biggest need and one of our biggest triggers in life for anxiety. Because isn't it true that people have two choices when they meet you? They can accept you or they can reject you. Have you ever had someone reject you? Or abandon you? Or withhold love from you? Especially someone who was supposed to love you, but they just didn't. So what happens to people who live in this environment is that this anxiety trigger gets spun way up. It gets spun way up. And so people who have this trigger, they get into relationships with other people, and they don't assume at the end of the day that they won't be alone. They assume that they will be. So what happens in any relationship you're in, I don't care, friendship, romantic, doesn't matter what it is, parenting, it doesn't matter. You will have conflict someday, guaranteed. No way around that, because you're just two flawed people together. And so what happens with people who are highly anxious, this is a big trigger for them, and they have some kind of conflict. Oh my goodness, immediately, the moment conflict erupts, that dial spins to 10 and they think, they're going to leave me. They're going to walk away from me. They're not going to want to be with me anymore. And so then out of that anxious position, they react. And many times it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. They do awful things to the person and end up driving it away and say, see, self-confirmation, that's what happened. I knew it was going to happen, but it's actually not inevitable. So here's the environmental cause for this one. Rejection, abandonment, conditional love, where connection was repeatedly broken or withheld from you. Have you ever been in a season of life where you experienced these things? Because if you have, then they can be triggers for you of anxiety. The interesting thing about this one is it doesn't even have to actually happen for anxiety to be triggered inside of you. Even the potential for it to happen can make you feel anxious. For instance, how many people are there today who will not ask someone out on a date? And it's not that they're not attracted to someone, or not that they might not be compatible with someone, but they're so afraid, the dial is spun so high, they feel so anxious, they just won't do it. How many people, and maybe some of you, you don't like your job, and there's a role you want to apply for, or there's a better job, or a career you want to move into, and your fear of being rejected is so, that anxiety, just even the thought of it makes you feel so anxious, you play it safe. Your body is saying you are in danger if you apply, because you might get rejected. Now, there is no great white shark at the bottom of that one. They may reject you, but they may accept you. Or like I said earlier, just even the idea of dealing with a conflict. Because isn't it true that some of you, you don't have to respond in any way, but isn't it true right now some of you have big issues in your relationships and you're not even talking about them? Because even the idea of bringing this subject up makes you feel so anxious that you're just going to keep quiet. Because your body is saying, no, the danger is if you do bring it up. So how do you know if this is a trigger for you? I wanted to make this really practical today. I hear some signs that this one's a trigger for you. You overanalyze when people don't respond quickly enough. Do you or anyone you know do that? It's like, oh, they haven't texted back. It's been 2 seconds. Oh my goodness, what's going on? Maybe they don't like me anymore. Maybe I'm being rejected now. It's like, you apologize when it's not your fault. You ever do that? Ever apologize when it's not even your fault? Because again, what happens is the conflict makes you scared, triggers the anxiety. And it's like, we got to get this conflict out of here because they could lose me, or they could leave me. And so I got to get it under control because conflict is the enemy. And it actually isn't. Conflict is the way to intimacy. But we're so afraid of being rejected like we've experienced in the past, or you struggle to say no. Are any of you people who really struggle to say no? Or do you know people like that? They say no when they say yes when they really want to say no. But the anxiety of saying no scares them too much because they may walk away. You assume you've done something wrong when someone feels distant. It's got to be me. It's got to be me. Or you stay in unhealthy relationships because alone feels worse. You ever seen that? Ever see someone stay in an abusive, unhealthy relationship? Because the anxiety of being alone is greater than moving away from this person who's hurting them. Big triggers, right? Big triggers. I want you to keep in mind what I said at the beginning. There's good news for anxiety sufferers. There's good news. We'll get into that good news, but first today we got to do the diagnosis. The second big trigger is this, the threat of not being in control. The threat of not being in control. So we got the threat of being alone, isolation, the threat of not being in control. And I want you to think about, I want you to go backwards in time. I want you to think about, what was your home like growing up? What was your home like? Because in case you haven't caught this, the environment that you've lived in has created some of the anxiety that you're dealing with. So if you were using one word to describe the home that you were raised in, would you use the word chaotic? Would you use that word? Some of you would. Would you use, was there a lot of anger in the home growing up? Was there someone with a bad temper that you just did not mess with? Did you have to deal with that? How about addictions in the home growing up? Raised in a home with an alcoholic, someone addicted to some other substance in their life, or abuse? Was there abuse in the home? How about inconsistent parenting? You know what that is, right? One day they're the mom or dad, the next day you're the mom or dad. Some of you were more of a mom or dad to the younger siblings than your parents were. So all of these things can be situations that again, make you feel like Your anxiety was appropriate. If you had a dad with a horrible temper or an alcoholic parent, your anxiety was life-saving. Because you couldn't just get off the bus and run inside with your book bag and throw it on the floor and say, hey, what's this? I'm home from school. Let me tell you about my day. Because you had to walk in and you had to gauge the room. How drunk is dad? How angry is mom? And so your anxiety was life-saving. So you had to be on alert all the time, which is what anxiety is. Remember, it's an alert system for your body. It's like, watch out, you are in danger. And unfortunately, some of you walked into homes and you were in danger. And so you had to be on alert at all times when you walked into the home because you never knew what you were going to encounter. And so your dial was spun up high. It's just like what happens when our soldiers go overseas and they come back. So they're overseas and they're fighting in a war, in a conflict where every day, if they're not alert, they could die. So their dial gets spun to 10, and then what happens? We bring them back here. Does the dial just go back? If you were raised in a chaotic environment like this, you think you just walked out of it and the dial went to 0? You were programmed to view people as dangerous. And so what often happens in this environment, and here's the environment summary, unpredictable, unsafe environments. And it doesn't have to be your childhood where it happened. Like I said, it could be a military experience. Many, many soldiers struggle with this and they come back from overseas. It could be an unhealthy relationship that you were in that was very abusive. And it rewired you. Your brain is wireable. The good news is it can be wired to be healthy again. That's the good news. And I'm going to say that over and over again in this series. There's real hope for anxiety sufferers. But unpredictable, unsafe environments create this. And so the thinking is, if I'm not in control, I might get hurt. So I'm going to control everything around me to prevent people from hurting me. Is that something that you might see inside of you? One author put it this way, he said, controlling behaviors often stem from anxiety. Because when things felt out of control, it's natural to want to control them to feel safe. But of course, we can't control other people, and we can't control other situations. So our efforts don't ultimately make us feel better. In fact, controlling behaviors usually create problems in our relationships. Now, like I said, it's so hard for me to do just a message like this where we just talk about diagnosis and understanding because I want to go into solve, and I like solving and talking about what the Bible has to say because ultimately the God of the Bible is saying, listen, the world may be out of control, but I'm never out of control. I am never out of control. And that's why I want you to surrender your life to me and trust in me. Because the Bible teaches, I love the book of Daniel. The prophet Daniel said, he, God, controls the course of world events. Some of you need to hear this after last week. He controls the course of world events. He removes kings and sets up other kings. He gives wisdom to the wise. He is totally in control. And he's saying, would you just trust me? Would you put your trust in me? Surrender to me. So do you see any signs of this as a problem or a trigger for you in your life? So here's the signs, okay? You have trouble delegating because no one will do it right. And I put right in quotes because you definitely know what right is. It's your way, right? Right. And everything else is not right. You get unusually stressed when plans change. You create detailed backup plans for your backup plans. So you struggle to relax unless your environment is perfectly organized. There's a lot of laughter, sorry. You feel intense discomfort when others are driving. I'm like, wait a second, that's a bad one? So I'm like, oh no, maybe I'm more controlling than I thought. Because I definitely feel uncomfortable. I thought it was just because they're a bad driver. I didn't realize it was me. And she's not a bad driver, just kidding. Do you see any signs that this is a trigger in your life? Any signs? Some of you are like, oh man. And again, you don't need to nudge anyone. Just let me do my job, so I'll take care of it, right? All right. All right, third threat, and big trigger for anxiety is the threat of imperfection. This is a huge trigger. And again, your environment is gonna have a huge part to play in whether or not this is triggering for you or not. The threat of imperfection. And it's really, how do you interpret failure and how do you interpret loss when it happens in your life? Because you're going to fail, you're going to lose. It just happens. So what goes on inside of you? I'll never forget, years ago now, I got to go to stay with one of my friends, and I was at their house for days. And I'll never forget, one day, they had a middle school daughter, and she went to the dryer, and she saw there were towels in it. So she took the towels out, and she folded them, put them away. How many of you think that's a good thing? A middle school girl on her own deciding to fold the towels and put them away. Good thing, right? Good thing, right. Okay, good, we're all in agreement. I thought so too. Little did I know. The mom came home from work, walked in, saw the towels and how they'd been folded. Oh, now some of you know where I'm going, all right. And I'm sitting right there, and the laundry room is right off this. She calls the girl out of her room. She never raises her voice, but she just goes on and on, verbally tearing this girl down as the stupidest kid, and how much extra work, she never used the word stupid, but how much extra work she's created and how awful she did and how inconsiderate this all was. And I'm sitting there going, my mouth is just falling open. I'm like, what am I watching? Shouldn't you just at least say, hey, thanks for trying. Thanks for being considerate. Nope. No thank you, only berating. And I was sitting there going, what am I watching? I mean, it was awful to watch. Some of you know what it's like to be in an environment like that. Here's the environmental cause. If you've been in an environment where love, acceptance, or attention were tied to performance, then this can be a big trigger for you. It creates the belief that your worth is earned through flawless execution. So how was failure treated in your home? So you could probably tell by my emotion what my answer is on this one. Perfection was the only standard. So how much of a trigger is this for you? What happens in your mind when you're not perfect? What happens in your mind when you're not perfect? You can tell that what this does, of course, is it leads many people into various paths of perfectionism. I used to think that perfectionism really, I had an idea of what it was in just like this narrow channel. It's really interesting. My mind has really changed on this. Perfectionism can come out in many forms. Obviously, there are people who are rigidly perfectionistic, right? Everything has to be exactly their way, and there's only their way, right? So many of you have had parents like this. You had a mom this way. You had a dad this way. You had a grandparent this way. They can be very, very demanding, very critical of themselves and critical of others. It's not just that they're critical of others. They are also very, very critical of themselves. If they make a mistake, they berate themselves. They have impossibly high standards. This is a person who breaks down if they only get an A on a test. You ever know any students like that? They start crying, weeping, just lose it because they only got an A. Some of you are like, I'd be so happy if I got an A. But they're not. Because the only acceptable thing in some of the environments you've lived in was perfection. And if you're not perfect, you're not lovable. And I'm withholding love from you unless you're perfect. This often triggers eating disorders, people with body image issues. You ever known anyone that struggled with any of those issues? Oftentimes it's because the only standard that was allowed was perfection, and if you weren't perfect, then you were not worth loving, and love was withheld. Workaholism, procrastination, I didn't realize that was tied to perfectionism. But it makes sense, doesn't it? Because if you think you can't do it perfectly, it paralyzes you. If you struggle with procrastination, is this underneath it? Is actually secretly perfectionism? People around you don't see it that way. But it could be what's going on. Or overthinking. Any overthinkers among us today? You overthink every decision, and it paralyzes you in decision making because what if you don't get it perfectly right? There are a lot of ways that this one really affects us. Because when you're not perfect, then you're in danger. Because that's what you were taught. in whatever environment it was home, in a marriage, some dating relationship, if you weren't perfect, you were nothing or lesser. And so you were wired to believe that you have to be perfect to be accepted. One of the things often associated with this is called catastrophizing the negative. And this is on your notes, so you can write that down. Watch out for catastrophizing the negative. So many of you have never heard of this before. It's an interesting thing to think about. And once you understand it, you will see it all around you. It happens all the time with highly anxious people. Catastrophizing the negative is when something happens that's not perfect, how do they respond? Do they act like it is the worst catastrophe that's ever taken place? So let's be clear what a catastrophe is. This is a catastrophe. This is what this woman discovered after one of the hurricanes that just went, or the hurricane that went through down south. When she came back home, that's her house. It's completely gone. That's a catastrophe, right? Things that are not a catastrophe. Getting a B on a test. Not a catastrophe. Losing your keys for the 7th time this week. That's not a catastrophe, right? Not a catastrophe. Your spouse forgetting to empty the dishwasher. Not a catastrophe. Making a simple mistake at work. Doesn't cost anyone anything. You've caught it, you corrected it. Not a catastrophe. And yet people who are highly anxious that have this trigger, they react like it's a catastrophe, like it's the worst thing that ever happened. Because their body because they have been taught to believe that any type of failure or lack makes them unlovable. And so the dial's set really high. If you want to read this, read the second book of the Bible, the book of Exodus. So Exodus is a story of God bringing his people Israel out of slavery in Egypt. We refer to a lot in our messages because there are so many lessons to learn from that. And I was so struck by it as I was prepping this message on anxiety. So here's what it's like. I mean, we can't even imagine. I mean, none of you have been slaves. I've never been a slave either. But thousands of years ago, when Israel was enslaved in Egypt, here's what it meant to be a slave. So you try and imagine what this was like. If an Egyptian wanted to rape your daughter, they could just rape your daughter, and you had no legal recourse. If they didn't like the way you looked at them, they could beat you, or whip you, or just kill you, and you had no legal recourse. And this is how you lived every day. So what level do you think their anxiety level was living as slaves? 10, right? All the way to the top. All the way to the top. These are super anxious people. And what do? They turn to God in their anxiety and they say, God, set us free. God, set us free. And they said prayer for hundreds of years. God, set us free. And finally, the time is right. And God sends Moses. And Moses is full of anxiety. He doesn't want to come and do anything. But God says, trust me. So Moses goes reluctantly, and he goes, and God delivers the nation of Israel, and they're on their way. And these are the most anxious people. Anytime anything goes wrong, they catastrophize the negative. It's the worst thing ever. Anything. And here's the kindness of God. I want you to see this. Go read that story of what he does for them. You know what he does for them? He does things for these people who are anxious that he never does again in the Bible. They're so anxious that he literally guides them by day with a cloud, and every night it's a pillar of fire. So these people have been taught that every person and everything around them is a danger to them, right? They've lived that way. So they wake up in the middle of the night and they're scared. All they have to do is, look, there's the pillar of fire. God is still present with us. And during the day when they're scared and they're marching to this new land they've never seen, all they have to do is just, a pillar of cloud, right? Just look, the presence of God. His kindness to these anxious people is amazing because he wants them to trust him. And yet they won't. In their case, their anxiety overwhelms even the kindness of God. So that one time, they're hungry and they respond like this: if only the Lord had killed us back in Egypt. There we sat around pots filled with meat and ate all the bread we wanted, but now you brought us out here in the wilderness, starve us all to death. That's what you did, God. Boy, the good old days when we were getting beaten, killed, tortured. Oh, we sure miss those, right? What are you saying? But that's what they're saying. because that's what anxiety does. Remember what I said at the beginning? How accurate is anxiety with reality? Anxiety destroys reality. That wasn't reality. They weren't happy when they were slaves. Anxiety destroys reality. So, here's some signs, some questions I want you to think about. If it's not perfect, is it all bad? If it's not perfect, is it all bad? If I'm not perfect, am I all bad? That's a big question. I'll tell you, it was one of the things that has been the hardest things about being a pastor for 35 years. One of the hardest things is there are Christians who come in with the expectation of perfection and put it on me and my family. And I am so sorry to disillusion you. None of us will ever be perfect. And if that's your expectation, can you please go find a perfect pastor? Because I'm not him. It's okay that I'm not perfect. If I have a problem with you, are you all bad? If you have a problem with someone, are they all bad? So some signs. You often leave things unfinished because they're not perfect enough. You ever known anyone like that? They don't finish things. They get paralyzed in the imperfections. You replay conversations over and over and over and over again, thinking of how you could have said something better. How you could have said something differently. You avoid trying new things unless you're absolutely sure you won't fail. Remember what I said at the beginning? What does anxiety do? It makes your world so small. So small. How do you respond to criticism? What does criticism do to you emotionally? What happens inside of you when you get criticized? Because somebody's saying you're not perfect. Does it shatter you? Ever felt like an imposter despite your accomplishments? And do you have trouble celebrating wins because all you can think about is all you could have done better? These are all signs that this is a big anxiety trigger for you. So as we finish up today, I want you to think about this. What's your anxiety level like today? If you were thinking on that dial, some of you are like, well, it was low till I came in here and listened to you. Now it's really high. Thanks a lot, Brian. It's like, I'm sorry. Like I said, just diagnosis today. We will get into the solve, I promise. But really be thinking about that. Self-awareness is always really, really important. You've got to be aware. You just have to own this. I see this all the time. This is part of my frustration. My job when I do leadership development and talent development is, the hardest group of people to work with in the world. People who lack self-awareness. Because they think they're amazing listeners and they don't listen at all. And they think they're incredible communicators and they're terrible communicators. And they think they're fantastic leaders and everyone wants to quit their team. They are the hardest people to work with. That's why I say all the time, self-awareness is the starting point. Do you see any of these triggers inside of you? That's where you have to start. You have to be honest about it. Don't be me, sitting there overwhelmed by anxiety, unwilling to say, I guess I'm struggling with anxiety. Don't be me, because you will pay a price for that. Do any of these signs point toward a trigger that is present in your life today? Are one of these triggers present? And I love this question. This one's really painful to me. Think back to your earlier memory, earliest memory of feeling anxious. What was threatened in that moment? Was it connection, control, or competence? If you spend a little time on that one, that will often point you to what your biggest trigger is. That was a story for another day. But I want you to remember this, the good news. Brains are rewirable. You were not created to live an anxious life. An environment helped change this inside of you. The good news is, our God is so good and so loving and so kind and so compassionate with anxious people that he can help rewire this. And there's real practical help for this. Let me have you bow your heads as we finish today. what I really want you to know is, there is no spiritual progress without the admission of the truth that we are not perfect. You will never know Jesus' grace and mercy till you acknowledge that you need grace and mercy. For some of you, this is why religion just feels empty to you. It feels meaningless to you. It's because you can't start with this honest, self-aware question. Jesus said, to be with my Father, you have to be perfect. How many unloving things do you think you've said and done in your lifetime? Like I said, just be honest. My list would be massive, an uncountable list. So the reality of that is that points us to the fact that we all need Jesus. I don't want Jesus. I need him. We all need him, whether you acknowledge it or not, because we are so far from that standard of perfect love. And the good news is Jesus Christ gave his life on a cross for us. He paid a debt for us on that cross to pay for all the unloving things you and I have done, so that we could be completely forgiven, made right with God. If this is what you need in your life, you're looking for more from God, then it will only begin at that point of surrender, where you put your faith in Jesus. And maybe today this is that day. Stop pretending you're perfect. You're not fooling anybody, and you're sure not fooling God. And instead, tell him that you need him. You can say something like this in your heart to him right now. You can say, Jesus, I am far from perfect, and I confess that to you. I admit that I need you. And I'm asking you to please forgive me and be the leader of my life today. In Jesus' name, amen. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch this service today. We hope as a church and pray that this was something that really helps connect you deeper to Jesus. That's what we're all about as a church. If you need to communicate with us, if you go online to penuelchurchlife.com, in the upper right-hand corner is a box that says, I said yes to Jesus. It also says, please pray for me. Just click on that, and it'll take you to a place where you can communicate with us as a church. So if you ever want any of the resources we mentioned in a service, go there and let us know. We'll gladly send them to you. Or if you made a decision to say yes to Jesus, or you have a prayer request, just let us know. And we're always glad to hear from the people who are watching online. And if we can continue to help you grow in your faith in any way, then we want to do that. So again, thank you. And our prayer is that you continue to grow and connect and find the true life that Jesus Christ is offering.